Okay, so we're getting started with part two of how to answer these essay questions. Um, I'll post these videos on La Lima, but the PowerPoint is already up there. Um, and what we went over last time is just to review what the questions are for the exam. Um, there's 20% of the exam is essay questions. And altogether, there are 6 questions. You have to answer the first 2 questions, and then of the remaining 4 questions, you have to choose 2 to answer. So altogether, you answer 4 questions. Each one is worth 5% for a total of 20% of the grade. There's Ethan. Okay. Luke, I love your ensemble there. I don't know quite what it is, but are you under the covers? Is that what's going on? It's
I'm actually at the beach. I
I was
forgot
gonna say,
about
are you at the
class.
beach? Okay,
Yeah,
that's
so
great.
but I just set up a little tent. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's looking like a little tent going on there. Wow. Well, that's one advantage of the pandemic is that we can have class on the beach, or some of us can anyway. But okay, so 6 questions, got to answer 4. The first 2, I'm saying answer these 2, and then of the remaining 4, you answer 4. Now, you may be asking yourselves, okay, that's 20% of the exam. Where's 80% of the exam? And the answer is I'm doing the best I can to wrap up all my grading and feedback and get the exam prepared for you guys. I do a new exam for this class every year, so that we're working with, to at least to some extent, with news. Did anyone find any things that they think are competitive or going to be good for a an exercise on either anti-vaxxing or conspiracy or some other kind of disinformation? Noe, looks like you're really excited about yours. No? Libby, did you find anything good? No? Luke? You find perfect? No, not quite perfect. Almost perfect? No. Perfect for the beach? So, all right. He's perfect for the beach. Allie, how about you? Did you find anything good?
No, unfortunately not.
Yeah, okay. I had a feeling it would be a bit of a struggle. Vincent, I skipped you. How about you, Vincent? Did you find anything?
No.
Did you guys find anything? Anything even reasonably good?
I don't know, like people don't want to get the COVID vaccination. That's all I could think of. That's like kind of like a conspiracy theory, but I don't know.
Okay, let me pause the recording for a second, and you guys can be my guinea pigs, and I'm gonna you guys will vote, okay, on whether you think this is a good one or not. All right. Okay. So here are the deal with the 20% essay questions are, um, 6 questions altogether. 2 are required, and then you choose 2 of the remaining 4 questions. First 2 questions, and we went over this. If you guys, I'm going to go over this quickly now as a review, but if you want it in depth, then go to last Thursday's video. Okay. Um, these 2 are the 2 required ones. Explain some of the parallels between the problems we face in the media today and the problems we faced with the media 100 years ago. And what were some of the concerns about the power of media back then, or about what we might call media effects, which is the power of media, and what are some of those concerns now? And then of the remaining 4 questions, you need to choose 2 out of the 4. So explain the connections past and present between private industry and government and developing propaganda and disinformation. Okay, so explain connections in the past and in the present between private companies, the business world, and what political figures or what governments do. Question number 2: what was proposed in the 1920s for self-regulation of the media? Okay, Explain the strengths and weaknesses of proposed solutions for today and offer your own suggestion for social media and news sites. So in other words, this has to do with the whole idea that like Mark Zuckerberg is being called upon, or Twitter is being called upon to delete certain tweets that are false, right, or offensive. Okay, and I'm saying let's look at what happened with that back 100 years ago and see what we can learn from that in terms of what can happen now. Question number 3, how do you understand objectivity? Like, what does it mean to you? Okay, and what concerns have scholars raised about the traditional notion of objectivity? What do you think? Okay, so what are some of the main complaints or critiques of that? And then this fourth question, and I've got to kind of move along today to make sure we get to it, is this whole idea that I explained to you all of pragmatic objectivity. Okay, and that's in the study I did on Walter Lippmann. Now, unfortunately, they screwed up the website. Ethan and I were just talking about this, so that my Teaching Our Journal article is offline. At least this morning it was, but they told me they're fixing it. So, but in that, I explain in that article about Walter Lippmann, which I think I made available on La Lima, that article on Walter Lippmann, this idea of pragmatic objectivity. I explain it at the very end of the article, so it's in just the last couple pages of the article, but I'll go over it today. Okay, and could this be useful as a standard for news organizations and social media platforms that provide news today? All right, so let's start digging into this. And again, we covered these first 2 questions last week. So what are the connections between media 100 years ago and media today? Well, I say here are 4 major connections. Back 100 years ago, you had the introduction of mass media. You basically had the birth of the mass production of newspapers and magazines. So you had the ability all of a sudden to produce, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of copies of a newspaper or magazine for affordable prices, whereas earlier it hadn't been possible to produce that many copies that cheaply, by nowhere near that number. You had radio being invented for the first time and becoming commercial for the first time. By World War I, it was still purely under control of the military, but by the 20s, you were starting to have commercial radio, and the 30s was the golden age of radio, when you had radios in every home. And you had movies. By World War I, you had the birth of the Hollywood movie industry, and you had the birth of Hollywood celebrities. And so you had a radical new technological change in media. Just like today, you have the birth of the internet, you have streaming television, you have social media, you have the iPhone, you have this whole explosion of new technology, right? Then that leads to these questions about media effects. 100 years ago, when radio was first being born and movies were first being born, and suddenly you could produce millions of copies of a newspaper or magazine, people thought, damn, media is so powerful now that you can control people's minds. And we talked about how many of you guys have seen The Social Dilemma? So, and Libby, what would you say the message about the power of media is in The Social Dilemma? What do they suggest is, how powerful would they suggest it is?
Just how controlling it is, I guess.
And they don't talk about the limits of it, do they? They talk about how powerful it is, but they don't.
Yeah, it's like subconsciously controlling, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but they talk about how powerful it is. They don't at any point talk about the limits of its power, right? So you get an impression of it being all powerful as a result. So.
Yeah, because it's controlled by the algorithm, which is just ever changing. Like they can't even, like it's past the point of almost being controlled, if that makes sense.
Right. And Luke, do you remember the example that I gave on Thursday of film and how powerful people thought film was 100 years ago?
The example?
Yeah.
Are you talking about the Lumiere brothers?
Yeah.
Yeah, the train.
Yeah. You want to explain that?
So when they first released a new type of film, and it was a video of a train, and it was coming towards the camera, and the people that were watching it thought that they were going to get hit by the train because they had never seen something like that before.
Yes,
They thought it was going to come off the screen and kill them.
yeah. So there's, they'd never seen a movie before, and there's a train rushing down the track at them, and now they say that story is apocryphal. In other words, they say that story is a myth. But I think it does an effective job of conveying the idea that people did believe that media was intensely powerful then. And I think those myths, even though it's a myth, a lot of those have seeds of truth in them, right? There's a reason they become sort of myths. So that's parallel number 2. How about, can anyone explain what the connection 100 years ago was between private and government? Does anyone remember that? Who was here last week?
Was this about advertising and propaganda?
Yeah. Do you remember
So
the connection?
they're both similar, but advertising is like a private sector made to sell you something, and propaganda was something about the government, like trying to convince you about something.
It's political messaging, right? So even if it's not a government, like ISIS or Al Qaeda, they're not a government, but they can produce propaganda, right? What about PR? What's the difference between advertising and PR? Does anyone know? What's the difference? Vincent, you remember?
Wasn't advertising is like a long-term yeah, like more of a long-term relationship because you have to like promote something more and more, and PR was just the handling of some things here and there. It's like more of a short term.
Kind of reverse. Advertising is when you like sell a product. PR is when you like build up the reputation of like your corporation or whatever. It's
Okay.
public relations, right? PR stands for public relations. So it's like how you develop a brand and a reputation. So, and the connection, does anyone remember what the connection was between the political propaganda and the advertising or public relations 100 years ago? How they were connected?
Wasn't it that PR didn't exist, but they used advertising people to start propaganda agencies or something like that?
It was more that the government, the United States government, wasn't the massive thing that it is these days. And so when the US government got involved in the war, they called upon private industry to help them out. Kind of like during the COVID vaccine issue, when the American government called upon the car companies or whatever else to make the respirators. Remember when that happened? So basically what happened was the American government was going to war, and it turned to its major private companies and they said, help us create propaganda. And so the private companies did. And then the private companies took those techniques and that expertise, and that became the birth of the whole public relations industry. And it certainly, advertising had existed before that, as had PR to some extent, but it was really in some ways a whole new birth for advertising and public relations because it was so revolutionized. And this all happened at the advent of media, right? So that's that connection. And why would I say that's a major parallel back 100 years ago and today? What's the connection between private industry and political propaganda today? How did Facebook start developing all of its techniques? Why? What was it trying to do? Was it trying to do it for Trump? Or was it trying to do it for another reason when it first developed a lot of its
Wasn't
stuff?
it just trying to sell its own product
Yeah,
originally?
or appeal to advertisers, right? We can find out everything you need to know about your customers. We can tell you where they drive, what they shop, what they like, what they don't like, who their friends are, everything you want to know about them. And then you can micro target your product stuff. And then the governments and the political candidates and everybody else said, hey, this is great, right? I can use this for my political messaging. So it jumped, right? It jumped from private industry into politics. And so I'm saying that's another parallel between then and now. So you guys get it? So the first question is, explain some of the parallels between then and now. Those parallels are, there's new technology 100 years ago, right, with the birth of mass media, and new technology now. For concerns about media effects, people thought this new technology was all powerful 100 years ago. People have no idea how all powerful it is today. There's these same beliefs about it controlling the mind. The connection between private and, hold on, how do I get, how do I, second. There she is. Hi, Mackenzie. So connection between private and government. There was that connection back then when with World War I, when President Woodrow Wilson recruited all these private companies to kind of spearhead the American propaganda for the war. And then that led to the birth of the public relations industry to a large extent, and to a huge jump forward for advertising. And these days it's the way social media companies develop this for private profit first, but then, you know, governments and all these other and candidates all found advantage for this in politics, right? And finally, all of this, the new technology, the concern about the power, the connection between, you know, first maybe it's for profit, but then they start using it to manipulate the political messaging. All of this leads to fear and concerns about the media, which lead to a call for regulating it. Like, whoa, 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 this is all getting out of control. And then why doesn't the government just step in and do it? Why, you know, if we've got this whole out of control thing, if we've got this all powerful media and them using it for war or for dangerous political purposes, or some tyrant is using it, why doesn't the federal government just come in and put a stop before it gets really destructive? Shouldn't they just like shouldn't US Congress just order Facebook to start shutting down all the false information on the site and all the anti-vaxxer? And they just pass a law saying, Mark Zuckerberg, if you don't do this, we'll throw you in jail.
Well, at that point, it becomes like a violation of the Constitution, because you're just taking away the First Amendment of people. You know, like people have the right, the freedom of speech.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's all this fear about what's going on with all this.
Well,
yeah.
does free speech, if your free speech is gonna, you know, cause like the deaths or harm of people, is it still considered like the same as if you were just like taking away someone's free speech of like what, like whatever else? Like, is there a boundary to it?
Is there a boundary to it? So Luke, what are the alternatives other than having Congress step in and threaten to throw Mark Zuckerberg in jail?
Well, like Twitter did a great thing where they said like, this is false, like this statement, like this tweet has been found to be false, so like,
Exactly.
you know, we're gonna let you know that, but like this could lead to serious like bodily harm or death or something like that, you know? So if you like are gonna step into it, you like have to make sure like you're still like having an impact, but you have to draw the boundary between whether or not this is free speech and you can say it no matter what, or like, yeah, this is free speech, but like it's false.
That's right. So hence parallel number 4. You were talking about Twitter and Twitter shutting it down, Luke. Self-regulation versus government regulation. So back 100 years ago, there was a demand that the news companies and the radio people and the movie people self-regulate, or the government is going to step in and regulate them for them. Okay. So let's look at that in a bit of depth. And then that overlaps with question number 2, which is the first thing of the 4 parallels is the concern about media effects, right? Oh, I thought we lost Luke, but no, there you are. So that second parallel is question number 2. All right, what were some of the concerns back then about the power of media and media effects, and what are some of the concerns now? So this is about the new technology, first of all. So back then, there was the mass media, print, film, radio. Now it's the internet, mobile media, and social media. This is a slide about what happened with print. So those are the new printing presses they had back then. You know, look at how large they were. Do you guys remember what the old printing presses looked like the hand printing? You know, what do they call it? Not hand printing, but letterpress. So something like, you know, these type of looking things versus this is what it is by the 20th century, right? These huge, massive machines, and they can do in color, and then, you know, papers start looking like that. And then radio. So by the teens, it's still not commercial radio. You still have people tinkering with it. By World War I, 1915, 1916, they're still doing this, and the military controls it. But by the 20s, all these other people start to broadcast, okay? And with film, you have in the 1890s, the first film exhibitions, then you have Nickelodeons where people drop a nickel into a machine and crank a thing and they can watch like a 5-minute film. By 1915, you have feature films, you know, most infamously the racist film, Birth of a Nation. By 1927, you have the first sound movie. And, you know, it's in 1912 that Hollywood is born. So there's that. And then as far as the power of it, right? Parallel number 2 and question number 2, actually, what's the power of it? In World War I, they start to realize, oh my God, it has this intense power. And this is a quote from Sacha Baron Cohen, where he's saying, if you pay them, Facebook will run any political ad, even if it's a lie, and they'll also help you micro-target those lies. So that's what we were talking about with you being able to get all this information on sources and target it to individual groups, okay? And then I talk about, this is just to distinguish between the two, which we've talked about. Disinformation is when you try to undermine any understanding of truth, whereas propaganda is the effort to persuade people of a certain point of view. So these are now slides for parallels 2 through 4, okay? So for what were some of the effects of media then and now? Basically, you had a couple of thinkers back in the 20s and early 30s, okay? So World War I had been this period when there had been, with all this birth of mass media, these efforts to use media as propaganda, to basically use media as a weapon of war. And it became this huge bloodbath, right? Like 200,000 Americans died in World War I, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Europeans were just chewed up in this thing. And so after the war, people were saying, what the hell was that about anyway? And people became extremely suspicious that it had been the power of propaganda that had driven a lot of the war and the bloodiness of the war. And also because like we have today, you were seeing all these changes in media and all this disruption and all of this intense partisanship and screaming and yelling, and fears about extremism in the media, the rise of we were just talking before about the Ku Klux Klan. You saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, for example, in the 1920s or the early 20s. So there was a lot of concern about media. So Walter Lippmann, who we've read a lot about this semester, was someone who said, maybe the ideas of the founders of the press being a free press and helping inform and engage the citizens, and that being like the blood of our in the spine of our democracy, maybe that's kind of almost outdated, because now that people have these massive new kinds of technology like the movies and radios, the rich and the powerful can control this, and the average citizen isn't capable of keeping up with an increasingly complicated world. And so the average citizen is easier to manipulate by this new and powerful media, mass media, okay? Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and all these people, they didn't have radio. They didn't have movies. So maybe this is outdated, okay? Then you had this guy, Harold Laswell. You had, at the same time as thinkers like Walter Lippmann, you had people like Harold Laswell who were professors like me. And this was the birth of the kind of field that I'm in, which is media studies. So media studies is born in the 20s. And Harold Laswell was one of the earliest professors who studied media. And he started studying it in the late 20s into the early 30s, when you saw the emergence of people like Adolf Hitler in Germany and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. And he thought, maybe what these people are doing, he was trying to understand how they became so powerful. And he said, maybe they basically, they create all these myths for us, and they tie these myths to certain symbols, right? And every time they flash one of these symbols, we have all of these associations in our mind about what these symbols mean. So the Nazis flash this symbol of the swastika, and they've embedded in people's minds all of these ideas so that they can kind of effectively manipulate people in that way. And the Americans have Uncle Sam, and they do something similar with this image of Uncle Sam. So that's what was being developed then. And then at the same time, you had people like Hitler developing his own techniques, right, as a leader. And he found that he could use the radio in this incredibly powerful way. He started blaming, we talked about in here the stabbed in the back myth. Libby put that in her propaganda poster, which is that, the German military was about to win World War I, but it got stabbed in the back by the liberals and lost the war. And they kept repeating that, whether or not it was true. Or one of the big lies that Hitler told was that the Jews were behind the Great Depression, that they were to blame for it. So this is something that we explored during our poster project. How do you create simple messaging using mass media to manipulate people? So all this is happening with the birth of mass media. And so is the Orson Welles radio story. Do you guys remember this? Does anyone want to try and explain what this was about? Ethan, do you know about the War of the Worlds broadcast?
No.
Okay, so this is 1938, Halloween night, right? Orson Welles is he ends up becoming the famous filmmaker who makes Citizen Kane, right? But in 1938, what he does is he has a radio show, and he puts on a fake news broadcast, and he pretends he's got this group of, you can see them in the audio around him here. He's got the musicians and everything else, the studio thing to do this radio show of a fake news broadcast of an alien invasion, a Martian invasion. And he gets on the radio that night, and he starts broadcasting like it's breaking news that the Martians have invaded planet Earth. And this turned out not to be entirely true, but the newspapers the following morning were full of the story that the entire country was set off in a panic because of Orson Welles' radio broadcast, that millions of Americans listened on the radio and thought that that their country was being invaded by Martians. So what would that have to do with the power of media? Any of you guys have any ideas? Mackenzie, what would that story about Orson Welles and his Martian invasion have to do with the power of media?
Just that what people listen to and what they hear affects how they act and how they're quick to rule it as fact, despite it not being fact, you know?
Yeah, the legend that comes out now, you know, years later, media historians have gone back and investigated this and found no, this didn't really happen the way it was reported in the newspapers at the time. But what people thought had happened that night was that it had set off this massive panic, which left the impression that you could literally control people's minds with the radio. So this leads to this idea, right? It's now, let's go skip ahead. So you were at 1938 here with this slide. Skip ahead just, you know, a year to 1939, the Nazi invasion of Poland, right? And then 1941 December, what happens December 1941?
Pearl Harbor.
That's right, Pearl Harbor. And we're all in a world war. And so the American government, with all of its money, once again turns to, you know, the rest of the country and says, we're going to need help developing propaganda. This time they're turning to this new field of experts, right? The Harold Laswells, the guy who develops this idea, right? And they're saying, we need an expert in propaganda to run our propaganda campaign. Guess what? We're the American government. We got millions of dollars here and we're going to war. So we need the top experts. So who steps up? This whole new generation of professors who say, you know, these people like Walter Lippmann and Harold Laswell, they all believed in what we're going to call the magic bullet theory. Those people had these primitive ideas that the media can just control your brain. But we study things scientifically, and we've discovered that the media has limited effects, okay? That's this term here, limited effects. Not the media is not all powerful. So the magic bullet theory. So Ali, do you understand what's meant by the magic bullet theory or the hypodermic needle theory? What theory of media would that be? I don't know if she's there. Ethan, you got an idea of what they mean by the magic bullet theory or hypodermic needle theory?
Not sure.
They mean that the hypodermic needle theory or the magic bullet theory is the idea that the media is like a magic bullet, or the media is like a hypodermic needle that you can just stick into people's brains and it just controls them. Okay. And the people that came up with these words, hypodermic needle theory and magic bullet theory, didn't believe in that. They said, no, the effect of media is limited. And we study this scientifically, which is why, because we know more about the media than anybody else and know how to study it with these cutting edge techniques, you should give us millions of dollars to develop your propaganda campaign. Okay, and so the American government basically did. They basically trusted these guys, and this launched the modern version of the field that I now work in, which is the idea that you would study, you know, through scientific methods, the power of research. And that leads to studies like the Bobo doll theory experiment, where they show these kids images of violent media and adults. You see in the top row, they show adults beating up the Bobo doll. Bobo doll is one of these big clown dolls. And then they let the kids loose on the Bobo dolls. And the kids beat the hell out of the Bobo dolls. And so they said, you see, television, we've now proven it scientifically, television, violence on TV and violence in the media provokes violence among kids. Now, obviously, there are problems with that experiment, right? Because, you know, beating up a Bobo doll isn't the same thing as beating up a person, and maybe the kids are just having fun and all that kind of thing, right? But so that's what happens to media research. They start to try and study it scientifically, and they start to look at media effects. So where does this all bring us? So then if we look at our modern times, these are the questions that we're dealing with now. Does media allow you to get into bubbles like our media today, where we don't pay it, we only live in our own realities, and we don't pay attention to what other people believe, and so, you know, we become completely immersed in our own version of reality. Are there algorithms that completely feed on our rage and our, you know, whatever gets us fired up and keeps giving us more and more and more of that stuff so that we get more and more fired up? Is there micro-targeting, stuff that figures out everything about who I am, so that every time I get a message, just like in this image, they're targeting me, okay? And then this is a quote from the guy running the Trump campaign in 2016. I needed to find the right people in the right places and show them the right message. Micro-targeting allows you to do is say, these are the people most likely to show up to vote, and these are the right audiences we need to show up. And so you micro-target them. And, you know, the thing that Sacha Baron Cohen warned about is if you pay them, Facebook will run any political ad, even if it's a lie, and they'll even help you micro-target those lies for maximum effect. So I kind of conclude this media effects series of slides with the picture of the Wizard of Oz. And we talked about this briefly last time, but what's the point of this Wizard of Oz slide? Anyone have any idea? What's the connection between that and what we've been talking about? Allie, are you there?
I just got back. I had to do something. Sorry.
All right. You'll have it on video. So you've seen this picture from the Wizard of Oz, right?
Yeah.
So why would I, in a slide about media and the power of media, put up this image? What does that have to do with media and the power of media? Do you make any connections there?
Maybe that there's somebody really behind it that's controlling everything, maybe.
Or that's what we're asking, right? When we're studying media, right?
Mhm.
Who's behind the curtain? Is it
Right.
just this old little feeble guy cranking it all up and seeming all powerful, or is it really all powerful? What's really
Mhm.
going on? So these are some of the basic questions, and I would argue we don't really have clear answers now, just as 100 years ago we didn't have clear answers then. How powerful is social media? I mean, do you think you know, or do you think anybody knows how much they can really control us or control our moods with it?
I think this kind of goes with that week we had where we studied like I can't remember now, but like how Russia kind of controls a lot of the news. And you know, there's probably somebody who's controlling a lot of what we see and what we hear and what's going on in the news, at least in the media.
Yeah. And a lot of the time, right, when we tune in on Netflix and we watch like The Social Dilemma, we kind of find ourselves taking for granted the idea that at least when we're being entertained by a cool documentary like The Social Dilemma, that the media is all powerful, that the media has taken control of us. You know, like Noah was saying that his dad watched it, The Social Dilemma, and immediately shut off all the notifications on his phone for social media. Other people said, I watched it and I immediately took Facebook off my phone and I haven't used it since, you know. But the thing is, we really don't know, right? We didn't know 100 years ago how powerful mass media is. even today, we're still struggling with trying to understand how powerful is film, how powerful is radio, right? We've done a lot of studies and a lot of research on it. And so arguably, if you review that research, you'll have a better idea. But with all of this brand new technology, we're only beginning to research the power of it. So I can't really say, could I tell you, oh, it's really, we overstate how powerful it is? I can't really say that because we don't know how powerful it is, right? So those are your answers. Do you guys now get a sense of your answers to these first two questions anyway? Question one is, explain some of the parallels we face then and some of the parallels we face now. Okay. And then the next four questions are, let me just skip ahead to the slides. So of these final questions, wait, number 3, explain the connections past and present between private industry and government. We talked about this already a bit today. Back then, the US government turned to experts from the private sector to lead its propaganda efforts. After the war, the media used these techniques to grow public relations and advertising industries. And I explained this earlier, that in May 2012, Facebook goes public with a business model created by CEO Sheryl Sandberg, focused on user data collection and micro-targeting. In 2012 to 2016, politicians, governments, and their intelligence agencies used these technologies for disinformation campaigns, like in Myanmar, Ukraine, and the United States. So that's the answer, more or less, to question number 3. So you got to choose, of questions number 3 through 6, you got to choose 2 of them to answer. So question 4, what was proposed in the 20s for self-regulation, and what are the proposals now? Okay, describe the strengths and weaknesses of these different proposals. So back in the 20s, for news, you had schools of journalism that were formed, starting with the Missouri School of Journalism, right, where I got my doctorate. Then you had all these professional organizations that come up, and those professional organizations adopted codes of ethics. So what are some of the professional standards that we've learned about this semester for journalists? What are some of the words for that? Any of you guys have any idea? Mackenzie, you know any of these terms we use for what journalists should and shouldn't do?
Are you talking about the code of ethics?
Well, what are some of the words that were in those codes of ethics? Those codes have changed a little bit over time, but what are the words that we associate with what reporters are supposed to do when they report?
I don't remember that well.
Objectivity, right?
Right.
That's one of them. Fairness, balance. They're not supposed to be biased, which is tied in with objectivity. Right? Accuracy. So these are all terms that are introduced originally in the 20s with the codes of ethics. And with radio, I put on this dial because the idea was that there were all of these different, in the 20s, when all these people started to broadcast on the air, there's only so many spots on the radio dial that you can broadcast. So pretty soon, the federal government had to step in and they had to regulate who was allowed to be where on the dial. It's sort of like if you had a public park, people couldn't just do whatever the hell they want in the public park. The government ends up having, the responsibility to control that park and keep it for the public. So one of the ways that the federal government ends up regulating radio by the end of the 20s is the development of the FCC, which is the Federal Communication Commission, which basically determines who's allowed a broadcasting frequency and who isn't. And this sort of happens. And then with the movies, what you had was you had some scandals in the early 20s that freaked people out. This guy, Fatty Arbuckle, who was a comedian, was accused of like a really, you know, graphic rape. And it became this huge scandal. And there were calls for Hollywood to rein itself in. And so basically, there was the Hays Production Code in the 20s. And that was an effort by the Hollywood movie studios to regulate themselves. And at first, this wasn't very strict. And a lot of the studios, especially when the economy got bad with the Great Depression in like 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932, they just blew off the Hays Production Code, right? And so then all of these groups started to get outraged that movies were becoming too violent and too sexual and all that kind of thing. And that led to this huge uproar, which ended up leading to the enforcement of a censorship code. Again, this is self-enforced. This isn't the government enforcing it. This is the Hollywood movie industry enforcing it upon itself in movies with you know, the Hollywood Production Code, in which finally gets rigidly enforced in 1934. So that's the answer to question number 4. The last two questions are objectivity. Do we understand, how do we understand objectivity, and what do you think? So what are some of the basic ideas that we have about objectivity, and what do you agree or disagree with about them? Let's see. Allie, this is something we've kind of talked about through the semester, but do you have any ideas about those? I can pull up the next slide, but do you have any ideas offhand about what do we traditionally think of as objectivity, and what are our questions about that or our doubts about it?
I think a lot of that comes from like more modern media.
Right.
But like specifically, I can't really think of one off the top of my head. But
Okay.
yeah.
Well, you know, one of the things I was thinking was maybe if I teach this class again, what would you think of this, Allie, if I were to say, okay, nobody, remember those discussions we had at the beginning of the semester? What if I had said to you all, nobody can use the word biased anymore to critique the news? Imagine how different those conversations would have been. How would you have felt about it?
Right. Well, I feel like it would have made it much harder because obviously there are still a lot of news sources that are biased, even if they don't openly intend to be. So I think that, like, yeah, that would have been very different for like the whole semester, but for learning in general, like, it's important to learn about bias and objectivity in order to learn
Right.
what's really going on in the media.
But so could we say that traditionally the notion of objectivity was that the news should be unbiased? You should be objective, you should not be biased, right?
Right. But like human nature is obviously going to force us to think one way or the other, unfortunately.
Right.
So,
Everybody has, as we talked about all semester, everybody has a point of view, right? Everybody has a bias.
right.
And so that gets to, how do you understand objectivity? What concerns have been raised about the traditional notion? Okay. And then what do you think is, I mean, do you have a view of that one way or the other?
Not like off the top of my head, not really, no. Like if I were writing it in an essay that like I was preparing for, probably. But
Okay.
yeah.
So you may want to go after this one, for example, okay? And so I say the textbooks discuss this, right? Detachment. Make sure the facts are doing the talking, not the reporter's own preconceived notions. Nonpartisanship. Reporters must offer both sides of each story. We talked about the problems with that earlier today, right? The idea of both sides or two sides to every story. The inverted pyramid, this is a way of organizing the information, right? Naive empiricism is the idea that I'll get to in the next slides, which is that there's such a thing as just the facts that are separate from interpretation, opinion, or ethics, okay? And then balance, the impossible yet all important goal that leads to undistorted reporting. Then these are some quotes to consider maybe when we talk about traditional notions of objectivity, like Walter Cronkite, who was one of those famous news anchors, like arguably the most iconic one of the 60s. He said, objectivity is the reporting of reality, of facts as nearly as they can be obtained without the injection of prejudice or personal opinion, right? Sorry, let me get this out of the way. Michael Schudson says, objectivity is a faith in facts versus a distrust and also a distrust of values. So values is another word maybe for ethics, for believing that there's a right and a wrong. Okay. And then Barbara M. Kelly says the reporter must remain a passive observer rather than a participant or an interpreter of the events being covered. And then issues of objectivity. Whoops. Can journalists be neutral or impartial? Would we want them to be? Is there such a thing as just the facts? Because then you've got these issues of interpretation, opinion, and ethics. So, here I use the idea of, if they're looking for just the facts, are they leaving other things out of the story that enable us to see like the whole elephant as just opposed to like a piece of the trunk, right? And then this is the final question and the end of my sort of discussion of this. Pragmatic objectivity, okay? What do I mean by that? Okay, this is a new concept for how we may, in the modern world, reconceptualize objectivity, okay? And the idea is this, that traditionally, say, back in the 20s or whatever, we had this idea. This is a thing that, actually, before I show you a diagram, this is a thing that Hannah Arendt suggested, okay, for us to think about. The facts, independent of interpretation or opinion, exist at all. Have not generations of historians and philosophers of history demonstrated the impossibility of ascertaining facts without interpretation, since they must first be picked out of a chaos of sheer happenings, and the principles of choice are surely not factual data, and then be fitted into a story that can be told only in certain perspective, which has nothing to do with the original occurrence. Well, let's break this down for a minute. The facts, independent of interpretation, exist at all. That's pretty straightforward, right? But what does she mean by this? The impossibility of ascertaining facts without interpretation, since they must be first picked out of the chaos of sheer happenings, and the principles of choice are not factual data. Mackenzie, do you have any idea what she's referring to right there? Mackenzie may have stepped away. You there with us, Mackenzie? I guess not. Ethan, you there? Well,
Yeah, I'm here, but
you don't follow?
not really.
Do you have a sense of what it means? How about Dobbs? Do you have an idea of what it means? The impossibility of ascertaining facts without interpretation, since they must first be picked out of the chaos of sheer happenings, and the principles of choice are surely not factual data. I think what she means, you guys, is that there's a difference between doing a math equation and trying to understand, what somebody is talking about at dinner, over the dinner table, right? That when we talk and we use facts, it's not just surely a matter of data. It's a matter of how we understand what different, pieces of information mean. And all of that is caught up in who we are and how we interpret what we're thinking about, right? And then she's, is saying, and then fit it into a story that can only be told from a certain perspective. So the facts only take on meaning when we tell them in a story and we give them meaning. Okay. Do you agree with that, Ethan?
I do. I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Dobbs, what do you think? Do you agree with that? That a piece of information only has meaning when we tell a story and we put it into it, give it meaning?
Yeah.
Okay, I did too, but let me push back for a second, right? I know how to walk, like I have a grocery store 100 yards from here. I know how to walk there. That's a fact, right? There's not a lot of interpretation involved in that or whatever else. I know that I was born and I know eventually, unfortunately, I'm going to die. That's a fact too. Those are facts too, right? What do you guys think? Mackenzie, are you there?
Yeah, sorry. I don't what can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. When I was trying to respond earlier, I don't think my mic was working, but I kind of get it. I mean, I could see how stories only necessarily work when you give it value, but also I could feel like there are stories that are out there that exist that don't have value given to them, but are definitely sharing information that is worth knowing.
Like facts are facts.
Yeah, exactly. Like how that one quote said, right? Or that one guy said, he was like, you are entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts.
Right. So you said you don't totally get it, but maybe none of us really get it.
Is it like a philosophical thing?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting pretty philosophical here, right? And I mean, because we're talking about objectivity, which is a philosophical concept.
Yeah.
And so I think that all I'm trying to point out to you guys is that this is tough, right? I mean, on the one hand, you can see how facts only have meaning when we put them in, when we interpret them and we tell a story and we invest them with something. But at the same time, we have to stand back and go, wait a minute, let's not get carried away. Some things are simply facts. Do you guys agree with
Yeah,
that?
I
Yeah. What do you think, Ethan? Does that confuse you? How about you, Dobbs? I don't know. I mean, I lost these guys. Anyway, let me wrap this up. So you could argue that at some point we had a more simplistic interpretation of all this, which is that we could keep them all separate. We had facts here, we had analysis, opinion, and all these things were different, right? Maybe they're somehow connected. So the idea of pragmatic objectivity is more like a modern idea that maybe all of them are connected. And yet maybe we shouldn't throw the idea of being objective out with maybe we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Right? Now, how would you do that? Well, I mean, this one guy, Stephen Ward, proposes a few approaches, okay? One is that this is the approach of holism, which is that we understand that they're all connected and that they're all interrelated. So we respect that, okay? So in order for a reporter to be objective, you understand that you can't completely separate out opinion or ethics or analysis. Okay, that on some level right and wrong matters, and some level opinion matters, and some level interpretation matters. Secondly, is the idea of active inquiry. That's the idea that whenever you write something, if you're writing a news story, maybe you give it your own interpretation, or maybe you come from your own idea of what's right and wrong. But then as a pragmatically objective reporter, you try to step outside of that and you try to be very tough on yourself and question whether you're right or wrong. Okay? And then finally, maybe the thing is to have a consistent, explicit code of ethics. So this guy, Jay Rosen, suggests that reporters next to a byline have a link where you click on it and there's a kind of bio or mission statement that says, here's where I'm coming from. And so maybe on that mission statement, you don't just simply have like the 10 commandments or something as your ethics. I would argue there's such a thing as emergent ethics, right? So during the Civil War, emergent ethics were the idea of ending slavery. During the Second World War, the new ethics that were just coming out and that people were just beginning to accept was the idea that of human rights, that humans all over the world have certain basic rights that have to be protected. You can't create concentration camps and things like that, right? Does anyone have any idea? I don't know if Ethan and Dobbs are still with us, but what the emergent ethics of today would be? Like, what are the new things that people are realizing that, hey, this is right and this is wrong, and people in the past haven't really respected that or understood that?
I feel like the most evident example, only just like from something that I think is just police brutality. You know, like people are obviously becoming more aware of that, or people that weren't as aware before. You know what I mean? And people are finally realizing that there's like a severity to the issue.
Yeah. So that's definitely one. I mean, it's hard. I find it hard to find a way to put it in a principle, like as a abstract principle. I see it as a concrete thing, like the police should not be doing this. But as far
Oh,
as,
okay, I get it. Like values.
yeah, I guess, but wouldn't,
Ooh, a good one could be like decreasing the wealth distribution.
yeah, although that's not a new idea either. A lot of these are ideas that are not new. I do think you're onto something. I think you're onto something with both of them. But then that's an interesting question of, is at what point does it become a new idea that hasn't been fully embraced? And I'll give you an example of what I mean, Mackenzie. Not that I don't agree with you about the two you've raised, but maybe something that's a little bit clearer in this sense. And that's on the next slide. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I could see that for sure.
Like in the past, we've never really thought that animals had any rights. We thought humans have rights, but not animals. And so that's an emergent ethic. And so if I was to do a byline in a code of ethics, I may not put these because, a lot of people believe in them. So that's not exactly controversial, or it doesn't tell the reader anything very specific about where I'm coming from. But if I put this down, then maybe when I report on a lot of what I report, that comes through in all these different things. But that's not at all to dismiss what you just brought up, because I do think that you're onto something with those. I just think it's a question of, how we explain that as an emergent ethic. Like what's new that didn't exist before as an idea. Because socialism or the idea of unions and socialism are not new ideas, right? But maybe there's some aspect of wealth inequality, which is kind of a newer term, right? We talk about wealth inequality or distribution of wealth. These are more modern terms. And maybe those are the difference. Maybe it's just that we're looking at it in a different way. And the same with, Black Lives Matter or police brutality. I just think if we could find the principle that's new, that previous generations didn't accept, it might be more powerful.
Yeah, I see that for sure. I can see that just because, like, obviously, as things become more relevant, those are just things that you'd want to discuss, but also because, yeah, I guess there's a code of ethics just throughout time, just regarding different things.
Yeah, I mean, and some things, like a lot of what Malcolm X was introducing in the 60s was emergent ethics, right? It definitely hadn't been adopted by people. Malcolm X wasn't just all peace, love, and whatever. He was saying, African Americans have to join together and identify certain rights and demand those rights by all means necessary, right?
But then again, wasn't Malcolm X partly inspired by the Black Panther movement?
Exactly. The Black Power movement. So, in the 60s, Chicano power, Black power, militant feminism, That eventually became known as identity politics, right? But in the 60s, these were brand new emergent ethics. So I think they're still to some degree emergent ethics, but I would locate the time when they were truly emergent to Malcolm X and his era, than more, not that they aren't still being fought over now, but so are basic issues of human rights and a lot of this other stuff. For that matter, slavery. You still have human trafficking and everything. So just because something is no longer an emergent ethic doesn't mean that it's no longer something that we're not still dealing with. But anyway, that's everything about the answers to the essay questions. Ethan, Dobbs, did I completely lose you guys?
No.
Okay, did you follow all that, Ethan? What I was saying about pragmatic objectivity?
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know. Dobbs, are you there? I think he's maybe left us, but let me just go back with you and Mackenzie for a second. Would you guys know which of these you would pick? So let me go back to this slide.
No, I don't. But I do have to get going soon. I got work at 4.
Okay. So let's call it a day. But of these 4, I hope I've been clear enough about all 4 of them that you guys could either go back to the video or just think about it yourselves, or maybe you've been taking notes, and definitely answer these 2, and then choose 2 of these 4 to answer. Okay.
Okay,
All right. Any final questions?
not for me.
All right. Ethan, you got any last things before we ring off?
Nope.
All right. Thank you guys for hanging in there. I know today's been a long session, but I hope it was, helpful in terms of, the exam and everything else. So I'll talk to you soon.
Right
Thank
on.
you.
Have a
See you
good one.
Yeah. Take care.